theyeshiva.net.
The summation of what we learned in the last year was to try to understand what does it really mean when we say that ein etzem, master al etzem, essence does not eclipse essence. And even though Shem Elokim is the source of Kalim and its function, its purpose, it represents the capacity to restrict and to conceal. Nonetheless, it's one with Havaya, and it doesn't conceal, when its whole purpose is to really conceal. We began discussing a mashal, a metaphor, the way it exists within a person between a mashpia and a mekabel, between a mentor, a teacher, and a student, a pupil. The key of successful education and communication and inspiration is always the ability of the mashpia to execute and utilize the koyach hatzimtzum, right? The ability to filter his wisdom, his brilliance, his genius, his knowledge, especially when the student is very remote, qualitatively speaking, is in a very different space, whether it's intellectually, academically, emotionally, psychologically, spiritually, whatever the space is. But when the Mekabel, as he puts it, is rochek, he's very remote from the mashpia, from his teacher, from his mentor, the one who wants to give. So this is critical, that if the Chacham Gadol, if the great sage, and may be really a great sage, if he will not curtail and filter the wisdom down to a level where the recipient can absorb it according to his capacity, not only will he not be doing him a benefit, he'll actually confuse him. His chushim, his mind will become overwhelmed and confused, and he'll actually shut down. Which is why the communicator must understand and appreciate the world of the Mekabel, be willing to go into that space, and have the know-how of how to take his own knowledge and wisdom and filter it in that way. Because if he gives him everything the way it is within him, all of the ideas in their pristine core, etzem chachmasai, it will create overload and shut down. Not only is it necessary for him to contain and limit and give only a little bit. If a teacher is learning Mishnayos with children or Chumash with children, he may see in the Pasuk or in the Mishnah or whatever he's teaching so much more, he may know so much more, but he can't communicate it. He has to be brief and concise and give the message in a simple way according to the capacity of the student or students. In addition to that, often he has to dress up the idea in a mashal, which he calls a dress, a levush, a garment. Because a mashal, a metaphor, is not even, you have a teacher who's teaching a Mishnah. He's teaching the same subject. He's just not giving the full picture, the full depth, the full breadth, the full length. But he's discussing the idea itself in a simplified term, in a concise term. He's bringing out the most external layer of it, granted. When you give a mashal, a real mashal, you're now transporting the idea into another realm that's not even directly connected to this discussion. That's the function of a mashal. A story, a parable, an illustration. But that is necessary very often for the audience to be able to grasp the nimshal only through and after the mashal. And all of this is included in what Chazal tell us that a person should teach. B'derech tzara. Derech tzara means you have to find the concise, brief pathway. The derech tzara. The Gemara in the beginning of Maseches Pesachim that we learned, Daf Gimel, discusses at length the value of derech tzara, of kitzer, and it trumps even things that are truly valuable. He speaks over there about lashon nakiya, refined language, It should be clear. It should be concise. The person should be able to go away filled, satiated, because the communication was crystal clear. You spoke to him or you spoke to her. Nonetheless, this doesn't mean that the teacher does not communicate his full knowledge. What it means is he compresses within the information, he contains and he compresses his seichel atzmi, the essential idea. It doesn't mean he's teaching him something else. In a concealed way, a good teacher, within those brief, simplified words, everything is there. The example is the Mishnah. The Mishnah was written specifically, but Lashon, the Rambam has an expression about the Mishnayos. Lashon Ktsara v'koilel inyanim rabim. It's very brief. That's the Rambam's expression about Mishnayos. Lashon Ktsara, it's brief, it's very concise, but v'koilel, if you start dissecting it, it encompasses a tremendous amount of ideas. Rabbeinu HaKadosh, the editor of the Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, took the whole Torah Sheba'al Peh, and he knew very well of the pilpul behind the arguments, behind the debates, behind every theory, behind every halacha. But he contained it in the Mishnah, and he wrote it out in a particular way that contains within itself all of the nuances and all of what, like a programmer writes out a program, but the back end, if you go to the back end, you see that these features and characteristics that the layman is using, which are extremely simple, really are only the most external layer of an extremely complex program. But you don't want to confuse, you don't want to overwhelm the layman. So lahavdil, what he says that you see in the Gemara, the pratim, all the details and the nuances of the Mishnah, it's all there in the Mishnah. The entire discussion of the Gemara is in the Mishnah. That's why the Gemara analyzes to no end every word of the Mishnah, the way it expresses itself, how the themes are, how the terminology is chosen, the usage of the right verbiage, etc., etc. But in the Mishnah, it's concealed. And the reason is because if it wouldn't be concealed, the recipient wouldn't be able to receive. Now we come to the next step. So let's now go further inside. Page Mem Tes in Via Daita, Tafresh Nun Zayin. The line starts Kanal. I think in the middle of the page, the line starts Kanal. There's a period. Vihine Kol Tzimtzum. Vihine Kol Tzimtzum Vehelim Hanal Hanisker Leil Hu Rak Lagabi HaMakabel V'Leil Lagabi HaMashpiyah. According to all of this, we understand the new point. And that is the entire tzimtzum, the entire restriction and concealment. When you call it a restriction and a concealment, it's only from one side. It's from the perspective of the student, not the perspective of the teacher, of the mentor, of the giver. Why? Parshas Sharei Gabe HaMashpiyah Meir Begilui Kol Oimek Sichloi V'Chachmasoi B'Haseichel HaMetzumtzum K'may Shehaya Kodim Shenestamtzum. When the mentor is teaching, the full depth of his ideas and awareness in whatever he's teaching is fully present in his mind, just like before he restricted it. Not only in the brief version of ideas, but even in the metaphors or parables he's giving. For him, it's not an eclipsing garment. He sees in that the full depth of the idea. Not only is it that in the restricted idea, in the filtered idea, for him it's not filtered. In other words, he sees the full depth. He sees how these brief, concise words contain within themselves the full depth, because from his perspective, he didn't need that restriction. He's filtering it particularly for the student. So therefore, even as he's communicating it in his world, this very communication is not blocking and obstructing and eliminating and concealing the full emes, the full truth and primis of the seichel. It's just a method. It's a method of communication for another person to absorb it. But even in the mashal, what is a mashal? A mashal is you're transporting the idea into another realm. You say, let me tell you a story. And the person who hears the story may never even go back to the original metaphor that the story is trying, or the parable is trying to convey. But that differentiation is only for the Mekabel. For the Mashpia, he sees in the mashal all the details of the parable. He sees simply as a mirror, as a reflection of the idea, the way it was mufshat. The way it was, mufshat means divested, stripped from any levush, any tzimtzum, and any helam. It's true. When you want to communicate, you have to dress it up according to the capacity of the audience. And every audience and every student needs different types of levushim, needs different types of garments in order to be able to gain access to this reality. And you have to know which levushim are appropriate. So for the student, the levushim are really garments, and they filter what is inside the levush because he wouldn't be able to access it. He would shut down, so he needs the levush. But the teacher, the real mashmiya, in the levushim, what does he see? He sees the levushim simply as containers for the full idea, for the full depth, and even in the mashal, in all the pratim, he knows what he's getting at. He knows why he's saying the mashal. Talking about mashalim, to give a mashal, ha'eretz hagashmi, and here the mashal actually, first the mashal was going from the understanding how the system of the divine in the world, so he goes to a teacher and a student, now he goes back. Ha'aretz hagashmi, the physical earth, who mashal b'chinas malchus shalamayla, is considered in Nister, in Kabbalah, in Chassidus, it says that the Eretz Hagashmi, the physical earth of our planet, is a metaphor for what we call Malchus Shalamayla, the quality or the characteristic of divine Malchus, divine kingship. What does this mean? Hainu, Avyusoi, its thickness, its density. Kadirusoi, its circumference, the fact that it's round, it's a sphere. V'koivdoi, its gravitational pull, its heaviness. Umashamatzmiach tzmachim, the fact that earth produces vegetation, v'chuli, etc. Many different features. When you speak about earth, you say planet earth. What does the planet earth mean? You could talk about so many different aspects. Harezeh, all of them is a mashal. It's a metaphor. L'bchinas malchus da atzilus. It's a metaphor to understand a little bit a quality which is transcendent. It's not a physical quality. It's called Malchus of the world of Atzilus, which is not a physical world, which brings into existence all of the creations of the lower worlds known as Bri, Yitzir, Asiya, from nothing to something. So in Pnimi, Satayr, and different Maamarim, they will bring our earth as a metaphor for Malchus Datzilus. Hine, hu roye b'ha'aretz hagashmi kol prote anim shel the Malchus Datzilus. When the teacher is giving this mashal to the student, he may be analyzing planet Earth. So it's basically, from his perspective, it could just be a conversation about the science of our planet, which is very interesting, which is very fascinating. And the teacher has to do it, because he wants him to be able to understand something that he has access to. He could see it with his eyes. He can imagine it in an easier way. There are manifestations of truths that are tangible, that are clear. That is why we give mishalim, any type of mashal. The Gemara Maseches Pesachim, just thinking, speaks about a principle, Daf Yud, Daf Tes, Daf Yud, speaks about a principle called Kavua Loi Bottle. Called the Parish, Meruba Parish, versus Kavua Loi Bottle. It's a very interesting principle in halacha. It's a principle. When something is in its Kavua, in its permanent place, majority never overwhelms it. It can get nullified in the majority. Once it separates from its permanent place, now it's vulnerable to bittul, to be nullified. Now, how many people just understood what I said? Okay, thank you. So what do you need? You need an example. Why do you need an example? I just said everything. I said everything, but it's a principle. It's an abstract principle. Even with the example, it's not so easy to understand the principle. But you need it, and the Gemara gives an example. The Gemara gives an example. What's the example? There are 10 stores on the avenue. 9 of them sell basar nevela. Or 9 of them, let's do the other way. 9 of them sell basar shchuta. They're kosher butcher shops. One of them is an unkosher butcher shop. You go and you want to buy food for the house for Shabbos, and you go into one of the stores and you buy meat. Right? There's a problem. You don't know which store it was. So what would you say? According to the laws of bittul, what are the statistics that it's kosher meat? 90%. Taka 90%. Rabbi Lahata's Torah recognizes the concept of bittul b'roiv, of nullification in the majority. And here it's not just majority. You're dealing with 90%. And what if you have 20 stores in one? Or 30 stores in one? 50 stores in one? The statistics are very, very powerful. Nonetheless, the halacha is kavua loy batel. Kavua loy batel means since the doubt was born where? The doubt was born in a place where the treif is permanent and fixed and etched. It doesn't get overwhelmed by the majority. But what happens if you find a piece of meat in the street, in front of the stores, and you pick it up? Now what's the halacha? You say, kol de parish, miruba parish. Once it's separated from its permanent place, where the issur is established, so you follow the majority. The majority is kosher. Now, I'm not now getting into the logic behind this principle. If it's a pasuk, if it's a svara, the Gemara in Ksuvas discusses this. Rosh Hashivas have Shemar Shkop as a whole maracha on this. What's pshat kavua? Loy batel. You have it alpi nigla, alpi nister. The Gemara then discusses a case of Teisha Tziburin Shel Chametz. A similar illustration with Chametz and Matzah. What do these illustrations help? The point is not the meat. The meat is a manifestation. But this is what allows a person to see it in a tangible way, in a tangible fashion. Stores I can see in my mind's eye. Meat I can see in my mind's eye. So it allows me now to go back from the story back to the principle. It's also negeya to halacha l'maisa. The meat is yenegeya. But for the principle, you give a mashal. Now that's a mashal that mamish illustrates the idea itself. But you understand that you have to now go back from the mashal to the principle. That's what the function of a mashal is. The mashal will just transport the idea into another realm that is tangible in one way or another to the person who's listening. For the teacher, the mashal never takes him away from the idea. On the contrary. So what's his mashal here? When in the Maimarim of Pnimiyus HaTorah we use earth as a metaphor for Malchus Datzilus, so even though you may be analyzing the planet Earth, so he says, in the earth he sees all the details of the Nimshal. Why is that so valuable? Because as a result, the person sees that the physical earth is not separate from its spiritual source. Rather, it is the Madrega Elyoina, it is Malchus Datzilus, the way it comes out in a material way. The link between the mashal and the nimshal is so valuable because the mashal is the nimshal. So as a result of seeing in earth a mashal for Malchus Datzilus, basically he's not seeing earth. He's seeing a manifestation of divine energy the way it's manifested in a material and physical way, in a physical fashion. But koyach ein sof, with the capacity of ein sof, it's the way divine energy comes out in a material way. It's not detached. The two are not detached. It's not, there's a God, there's Malchus Datzilus, there's planet Earth. Hashem created planet Earth. No. As a result of seeing the science of the world as a mirror of the higher worlds, what happens? The Gashmi is not a Gashmi anymore. The Gashmi is a Gashmi, but the whole Gashmi is a metaphor for the Ruchni. It's an embodiment of the Ruchni. It's not the Pesnifrid, separate, something independent from its own source. The shoirish of everything in physicality, the whole Gashmi is a mashal for Ruchni. That's what it is. So I could look at it from the external perspective, and all I see is the mashal. From the teacher's perspective, the whole mashal is nothing but a manifestation of the nimshal. So when you're talking about information, you have a mashal to bring out the idea of the nimshal. When you talk about the world, the physical world as a mashal, as a metaphor for the spiritual world or for the divine energy on higher levels of consciousness, it's not two separate things. The mashal is actually the nimshal. It's the way the nimshal comes out in a physical form, in a physical way. It's not two separate things. So the world is a different place. That means there's no nekuda. There's no point in the physical world that is not a manifestation of spiritual divine energy. There's no law in mathematics, no law in biology, no law in physics, no law in science, in geology, in astronomy, in cosmology, in zoology, in botany, etc. There's not one nekuda, not in a snowflake and not in a grain of sand, not in a shrub and not in a bush, not in a squirrel and not in a cheetah, that is not a manifestation of spiritual energy. Like you're quoting from davening, Va'ata mechayes kulam. It's not pshat Hashem created it, but the relationship between them is simply as creator versus creation. He just created it. It's much deeper. What we're saying here is that the entire physical universe, the entire physical cosmos, and every detail of it is a manifestation of a particular quality of the divine. It's divine energy expressed through physical phenomena. That's why it's a great mashal for the nimshal. Because in this case, it's not a mashal for the nimshal. The mashal is the nimshal. The nimshal is in ruchni, so it's intangible. The mashal is gashmi, so it's tangible. So the physical universe essentially is the method to access the inner energy. And that's what he says. That's the parentheses. It's not just from the perspective of the teacher, you don't see the mashal as separate. By not seeing the mashal as separate, what we're learning is that the Eretz Hagashmi is not separate from its source. Rather, as he puts it, he madrega halyoina. It is the ruchni. It is Malchus Datzilus. The way it comes down, bahakshama. Bahakshama means the way it assumes a material incarnation.
But somebody has to tell me this. I can't figure it out.
That's why I'm telling it to you.
I see an apple, a tart apple. Now it comes from Chesed Gevura.
Okay, that's why we're learning.
What's about bad Gashmias? Bad Gashmias things also roughness?
What do you mean by bad gashmis? Disease, pathology, entropy.
That's behavior.
Everything has a source. The question is how far the mashal is from the nimshal, right? But everything ultimately has a source that when it trickles down and trickles down and trickles down, sometimes can end up in a distortion. There's a famous Gemara, Maseches Chulin, the Gemara says, Kol ma da aser lon rachmana, shara lon kavaseh. Which means whatever the Torah prohibits, it permits something that's similar. He gives many examples. The Torah prohibits blood, but then says you can eat the liver. The liver is filled with blood, that's why the laws of kashering a liver are much more complicated in order to extract all the blood because it's so filled with blood. The Torah prohibits chazah, swine, and allows shibuta, which has a similar taste. The Torah prohibits marrying a brother-in-law and then allows yibum, levirate marriages. Whatever is forbidden is a parallel shadalon kavaseh. It's an interesting gemara. It's like almost God told it, don't worry, I'll give you compensations like we have today, sushi, yeah? There's this crab sushi and lobster sushi and everything. It's not the real thing. And the mumchim say, those who have experience before they change their life, say, but for us FFBs, who knows the difference, right? So the Torah says, don't worry. It's taka awesome, but I'm giving you a compensation. So the Marsha says that the vort is, the Marsha over there in the Gemara, Chidush Agadas, says, on one level, that a person should understand that there's deeper, the mitzvahs are deeper than what he understands. It's Gzeiris HaMelech. And therefore something similar, here it's forbidden, and here it's permitted. That's what the Marsha writes. There's another interpretation that is connected to your question. Everything in this world, its shirish is kedusha. Its source is kedusha. Its ultimate shirish is alakus, it's godliness. Everything. Even those things that ultimately come out in this world, and a Jew is forbidden to eat them or benefit from them, and so on and so forth. So in other words, the kedusha of it is not manifested, or it's not easy to be manifested, but in its shirish, in its source, if it's traced back all the way to its original source, it's all holy and divine. The Shem Shmuel has a whole shtickle. The Gemara says that one of the Tanoim bragged and he says, "Yecholni l'tayir sheretz b'kuf nun taimim." I could be metayir a sheretz through 150 svaras. A sheretz is one of the 8 types of insects that they contaminate a person. Their corpses contaminate a person. For example, a weasel, etc. So the Gemara says, he said, I could find 150 svaras. There's only one problem. The Torah says it's not tahir. But I can find 100. What's the Greisa Gedula? That you know how to delay a cup? Huh? Yeah, you als kennst du verkrummen. What's the big? Fine. So he brings out this point, similar point, that in its mucker, everything comes from Tara, everything comes from Kedusha. However, sometimes there's a distortion. As it trickles down, there's a distortion. Like, talk about communication. How many times does it happen that the student doesn't understand what the teacher is saying? And in his perception, the message is misconstrued, especially when it goes into the world of a mashal. I remember I was once in Virginia for a lecture, and there was a Sunday of lectures, and there was supposed to be 3 lecturers. Rabbi Breidowitz was then in Baltimore, Rabbi Breidowitz from Ner Yisrael, and the doctor, and Nat Lewin is a big lawyer, and I was supposed to speak. There was a huge snow. It was a 30-inch snow in Virginia, so I had to take over both of them, because I was there ready for Shabbos. So basically, instead of speaking for an hour and a half, I'd speak a whole day. Good, so I did that. So it wasn't so easy. It was a big oilam. And so I remember I started off I divided it into a few pieces. The first segment was 2 hours, 2.5 hours. So I started off with some elaborate joke, some routine. And I finished 2.5 hours, and the topic was Tzimtzum. The topic that was given to me was Tzimtzum. Tzimtzum according to the Arizal, and the debate between different Mekabalim, Tzimtzum is Kipshut and not Kipshut. which we're soon going to get into. And somebody came over to me afterwards, I'll never forget, and he said, the opening joke was very good. The opening joke was very good. So I thought I was doing an opening in order to get into another topic. But by him, that was the beginning, the middle, and the end. He never had to sit through the rest of it. I guess he wanted to be polite. So sometimes you have that the student remains, here it's not even a mashal, it's a joke. Joke is not a mashal. Sometimes a joke is a mashal, if you're going to explain the joke. Sometimes a joke is just a prelude. But the point is, that's where he is. So very often, in the flow of energy from the higher to the lower, there's a disruption, there's a distortion, and therefore it comes out in Tumah. And this is what the Gemara says, anything that's Asur, Sharalon Kavaseh, there's something similar that's Tahir. And if you go back to the Shirish, over there you'll find the healing of it, you'll be able to heal. Which is why there's nothing ultimately in life that can't become a catalyst for healing, that can't become a catalyst for recovery. Because there's always a connection, even if it was lost in translation, as we say. You know the telephone game, right? And then the one at the end. The broken telephone game, right. Because the energy is not anymore seamless. It's not a seamless flow. That's why there's these concepts. But ultimately it's rooted in a place of Kedusha. The Zohar says, on the word Parah, we're learning now these parts about Parah. The Zohar says, Parah comes from the word Priya. Priya means opening, Parua. So he says, Diminei ispirian v'izgalian kol nahirin. He is the source from where all the lights come out and they're open. Which part are you talking about? The Ramah says on Achashverosh, Achariz v'reishis shaloi. The end and the beginning of his is his. Which Achashverosh are you talking about? You talking about God? You talking about Achashverosh? So we say, Stam, it's some marshal. No. Even Parah down here, everything has a shirish. It doesn't mean that Parah down here was a saint. He was not a saint. He was a Rosh Merusha. Depends which Parah. There were different levels of Parahs. But assuming that the Melech Chadash is the Rav and Shmuel, it's not a Chadash Mamash. But the point is that everything ultimately has a source in the Nimshal. The question is, how much can it reflect the Mashal? The value in science and physics is, it was not corrupted. The snowflake is not corrupted. The structure of the planet is not corrupted. When you're studying a tree, you're studying God's natural world, right? There's not the human initiative and our proneness to immoral behavior, where it's much harder to find the key. If you talk, for example, in a person's psychology, right? We know every distortion in a person's makeup, in your self-perception, it doesn't begin in a horrible dysfunction. It usually begins in a very innocent place, a very subtle, innocent place. It was a survival tool, perhaps, that the person had to develop, and now they live this way. So if you go back to the Shirish, you will usually find a lot of light, a lot of purity. But the way it comes down, the way it's manifested, is often distorted. So the link between the mashal and the nimshal is critical, because the mashal really is the nimshal. It's the way the shirish of the world comes out in a physical incarnation. And that's what Hishtalshalus really means. When we speak about Seder Hishtalshalus, the order of evolution of the world, it's not two separate things, the lower and the higher. The lower is a manifestation of the higher in concrete terms. So therefore, there's nothing you don't talk about. There's nothing in any place of the physical world or physical life or a person that you could, when you talk about it, those who see the mashal as a reflection of the nimshal are always talking about, they're talking about elokos, they're talking about godliness. Because the gashmi is the ruchni. It's the way the ruchni comes out in a gashmi. But it's really one thing. Yeah. There's an expression in Chagiga, Chulin shenasu al taras HaKodesh.
In relation to his question,
Isn't every detail also straight from Hashem also? You know, the Meir Mezbat,
In a Chanami.
every little detail.
In a Chanami, yeah. In a Chanami.
So how is gravity of the earth reflects the Malchus? What's the shape?
Okay, you'll figure that out. You're a scientist. You'll figure that out already.
I'm trying.
How is gravity?
He wants to know how gravity of the earth is reflected as a reflection of Malchus Datzilus. But you see, he says here, he says the thickness, the density, the roundness, the heaviness, right?
Heaviness is gravity.
Heaviness, right? Which is connected to gravity, certainly. And it's vegetation power. And then he says, chuli, everything else. V'chuli, everything else. He just lists off a few things. And he lists off these things because don't think the thickness of earth, what's that's connected to Malchus Datzilus? That's just a physical property. We're going to start talking about the thickness. And then you're going to talk about the roundness. Then you're going to talk about the heaviness. This is pure physical phenomena. As a result of the various forces of nature that exist. And that science and physics dedicate so much space to appreciate and to understand, at least based on how much we can understand. And its vegetative powers has to do with the qualities that exist in the soil, the combination of the seed and the soil, and what it produces. But that's the point, that even the most remote, what would seem as the most remote physical phenomena that is not spiritual in any way, it's not divine in any way, essentially, it's a mashal for a nimshal, not just a mashal to understand the nimshal. It is the nimshal. It's the way the nimshal came out in Gashmi. Because here it's not a teacher finding up some mashal from far away to explain the nimshal. Here the mashal evolved from the nimshal. It's what does he say? It's the he madrega hel yoina shaba b'koyachein soif b'hakshama. Das is Malchus Datzilus. It is the madrega hel yoina. The way it assumes a physical seer, a physical crust. But what is it? What is the physical crust? It's just a manifestation, a reflection of the divine energy that is represented in the physical crust, and therefore every feature and every characteristic and every nuance and every detail of every physical phenomenon that you'll discover, as long as it's true. We're talking about true science, true physics. There are theories that people make, and then 50 years later they're disproven. But if it's a truth about the physical world, that truth is a divinity being expressed.
Give us a motion.
Avdem gufa mashal. Avdem gufa mashal. When you understand this, it's a different world. There's no two worlds. Heaven and earth. It's one. It's completely one.
So it's Simpson related to Big Bang.
This is an introduction to understand what Tzimtzum is. The Maamar is trying to explain what Tzimtzum is. Koyachat Tzimtzum, Elokim, in any level you're manifesting, this is the beginning to understand what Tzimtzum is.
Something that's not true, like a false theory or a disproven theory, it's not Elikus?
I'm saying, when you say the fact that a person produced it, that also has a shayrish. If it's part of the human psyche, that capacity also has a shayrish. You understand? But I'm talking about when you're talking about the physical planet representing a divine energy, if it doesn't exist in the physical planet, I just thought it exists. They used to speak about ether, right? Ether. What was the big theory? Ether for many years. Yeah? If it turns out that it doesn't, at least we don't know that it exists, that was my point. So then it's not a reflection of energy because it doesn't exist. That's what I meant. I didn't. The fact that a person came up with that idea, yeah, that itself, every dimension of the brain, of course, is the same thing. So the fact that the brain has a capacity to come up with different ideas, some of them pure stupidity or foolishness, that also has a shayrish.
So in a sense, someone could experience Elikus spending their whole life looking at a grain of salt, but it's much more geschmack to experience Elikus, learning Torah and being a little bit more involved on that level, maybe.
Somebody could study a grain of salt and experience Elikus. That's what he's saying.
Yeah.
If you see in the mashal, the nimshal, you're not studying a grain of salt. You're studying Elikus the way it assumes a physical incarnation called a grain of salt.
I think that's about Gisa Bayam and Belela. Not just the words busy with the words. Find the Torah and Hashem and every little detail where we are, what we see. Young on Belela, to see it all the time. Not just.
You have this in Torah itself also. Lahavdil, but you have this in Torah itself. Pnimiyus HaTorah, Nigla the Torah, is called a nimshal and a mashal. The Vilna Gaon, in his commentary on Mishlei, explains this at length. The Baal HaTanya in his Maamarim. Pnimiyus HaTorah and Nigla the Torah are shtickle Gemara. Yeah? People think there's two Torahs. There's the Torah of Kabbalah, Nister, the Torah of Chassidus, that's Nister. And then there's Nigla the Torah, the revealed Torah. Mishnayos, Gemara, Shulchan Aruch, Rishonim, Achronim, Poskim, Shal Setshuvos, Mefarshim. One deals with some, spooky stuff, and one deals with concrete stuff. B'dikas Chametz, Muktzah, Lechi, Koira, Erev, and Sukkah, Nezikim, whatever you're dealing, Shutfin, Tumah, Taras, Zroyim, whatever you're dealing with in that sugya. But it's concrete, it's Nigla. But it's the same Nekuda, really.
Which is a nimshal.
There's no Nekuda in Nigla that's not a reflection of Pnimius. And there's no Nekuda in Pnimius that's not manifested in Nigla. There's no such a Mitzias. Every Nekuda in Nigla is a mashal for the Nimshal. Over here, of course, the mashal itself is infinitely divine. Because it's really one. It's not two separate things.
So the Tzimtzum is also Ein Sof.
Oh, that's what we're getting at. That's what we're getting at. Just don't fly away yet. Kalim. Huh? Gravity, yeah. The COVID.
When he says that our gravity, our density, our thickness, is he referring to our concepts of these things or the exact ratios, the exact numbers?
Excellent question. Yeah, is he referring to our concepts of these things or the exact ratio? And the answer is the latter, not only the former. The former and the latter. Not just our concepts. In other words, you talk about vegetation and it's a good concept to bring out some spiritual concept as a marshal of a teacher. No. The exact ratio, the exact dimensions, the exact physical properties, even though they seem completely physical. But in some form, they are a mashal for a nimshal in which the mashal actually evolved and is a manifestation of the nimshal. It's the way a particular divine energy assumed a physical and tangible incarnation.
It drives the physical.
That's what drives the physical. It's not, there are certain ratios, there are certain phenomena, and let's use them as lessons in life, for example, right? Which is very nice, it's beautiful, it's much deeper than that. The reason you have these ratios in the physical world, the reason you have this composition, the reason you have this type of chemistry is it's driven, it's fueled. It's basically a manifestation of spiritual truth. Istakel baraisa bar alma. That's pshat. The Zoya says he looked into Torah and he created the world. So what does it mean? The Torah is a blueprint for the world? When you look at the blueprints of your home, you're going to see your home in the blueprint fashion. Open up a Torah. There's 31 verses about creation. Then Cain murders Hevel. Adam eats from a tree. Yosef's brothers throw him into a pit. Where do you have a blueprint for the world there? Jews go to Egypt. There's 10 plagues. They go out of Egypt. They build a Mishkan. Where do you have blueprints for the universe here? Where do you have a blueprint for the world? And the Mishkan is close to 700 psukim. You know, in the first map of America, in the 1700s, they started, they always tried to make maps, and in the 1700s, somebody brought a map from America to the Alter Rebbe, to the Baal HaTanya. And he took a look at the map, and he said, there's a mistake. He showed in America there's a mistake somewhere. Okay, what does he know? Is a Yid sitting in Lyozhny, a little village in Belarus, Maamar, a tiny little village. Say there's a mistake in the United States. You know, today Belarus and America not so far, but then Belarus and America were very, very far. It's the 1700s. America was just developing. He said there's a mistake. So at some point, they I guess another map came or some new report came that there was some distortion over there. So somebody asked the Balatanya how he knew. So he said that in the Beis of Bereshis, you have a picture of the whole planet. And he saw that the map wasn't consistent with that picture. So he knew there was a mistake. So somebody once told over the story in 770 at a Fabrengen in front of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. So the Rebbe said, the ikir is, as when mekumchen in America, is in the toes. The main thing is, once you arrive to America, you shouldn't make the same mistake. In Lyozhny, it was clear. When you come to America, you shouldn't make the same mistake. In other words, that the mashal and the nimshal should remain connected. So what should I bar alma? It doesn't mean that you look into the Torah, you can have a map of what the earth looks like. It means if you have the ability to be able to see the spirituality and the energy within every physical phenomenon, you will see how the Torah is a blueprint for it. But it's a much more abstract blueprint. It's not a blueprint the way we're used to. But it's takel b'raisa bara alma, because every physical phenomenon in the world originates in Torah. Why does it originate in Torah? It's not a gzeirus hakosov, because that's its whole metzius. That's its whole entity. So the last detail is a manifestation of this.
There's 4 elements: earth, wind.
That too.
So it's an exact muscle of the nimshal. Perhaps, I mean, they said there's like 73% water on the earth, but maybe in some type of creation, there's a quarter that one, a quarter that one, a quarter that one. Yeah.
In Kisvei Arizal it says Eish Ruach Mayim Afar is connected to Dalet Oisis of Shem Havaya. What's the connection? What's Yud-Kei Vavke with Eish Ruach Mayim Afar? And the answer is that is Eish Ruach Mayim Afar. What's the connection is coming from an external perspective that doesn't see it from inside in. We see everything from outside in. We don't see it from inside out. When you see it from inside out, the Eish Ruach Mayim Afar is Shem Havaya. It is Yud-Kei Vavke. It's just the way it assumes a physical phenomenon. That's pshat in all of Kabbalistic literature, people who make yichudim. What's pshat making yichudim? Those of you who dabbled in these things, or you decided one day you're a Kabbalist yourself, you're familiar, you start making yichudim. What's making unifications? Yichudim means to be, the first thing of yichudim, it means to be able to see the achdos. To be able to be ma'ached, the chitzonis and the pnimis, the outside and the inner, the outer and the inner. And that's the reason, from my flesh I perceive God. Why from my flesh will I perceive God? What does my flesh have to do with God? The answer is, Nasa Adam b'tzalmeinu kidmoseinu. It's not a question how you perceive God from you. You are a manifestation of the divine. So there's not one nekuda in your body, in your mind, in your brain, in your soul that's not mirroring the truth of the divine. So now Rabbi Isaac is asking, what about all the distortions that you have? That also mirrors in its source, but you have to see where it got stuck, where it got in the trickle, in the flow, where there's a distortion, where there's a disruption. Just like in the game of telephone, just like somebody could say that they heard something from their teacher, and they say the exact opposite of what he said. Why? Because they heard it according to their capacity, and they misconstrued it. And then you could go back and see. And you go back and see where... Yid sent me an email yesterday. It's an interesting thing. Drew sent me an email that he heard a shir I gave on Tisha B'Av about relationships, and I said that it's a mistake that teachers teach chasanim and kalas that physical relationships are it's a negative thing, and you just have to do the minimum, and it could bring people down, and people are just behemoths, etc. So, and I explained. You remember, I gave a whole shit about it. So this person wrote me a whole long letter trying to explain to me where I went wrong. So when I was reading his letter, I understood exactly how he completely misunderstood what I said. He understood what I was saying, that intimacy by everybody is not about, there's nothing spiritual about it, just physical, and that's what God wants, and that's it. So he says, what are you talking about? How can you say this about Yaakov and Rachel and all that? He misunderstood. My intention was the exact opposite. That in Judaism, the spiritual and the physical are not two separate things. The physical is the ultimate manifestation of the spiritual. The guf is not a tomedik azach. Fakert. It's a reflection of the deepest holiness. Can it be distorted? Of course it can be distorted. That's why you need Torah to be able to. So when I was reading it, I was trying to understand what did I say, but then I realized, from his perspective, perhaps the guf is completely a negative thing. So when I was saying that the guf is not a bad thing, what did he hear? There's no ruchnis. So when you see that, you always have to see, what did I hear? People hear things according to what they could hear. It's not their fault. They have their tools. And then they judge it based on that. So did it come from what I said? It came from what I said. But it got a little stuck in the process. You understand what I'm saying? And when you go back to the source, then everything, you could see how everything could be sweetened. Rabbi Shlomo wants a mashal for a bunch of these things. So Be'ezer Hashem, in the next shir bli neder, or the shir after, I'll give a few mashalim to see this truth in the physical world and the spiritual world. We'll discuss we'll discuss the white blood cells and red blood cells, and we'll discuss the spaceship. Those are two things that, just as a mashal, we could discuss billions and trillions of things, but first of all, I don't know billions and trillions of things. And second, well, you have to choose some things. So, thank you. Das Slichus heint, yeah? To start right away, huh? It doesn't say everything has a compensation. It says whatever is also the Torah was also matter.
But Litzman wants to know which time.
I have to remember. I could tell you in a moment. Huh?
In this discussion,
Yes.
take a simple thing, that
Yeah. I'll look it up. Yeah.
a teenager is severely depressed.
Yeah. A teenager is depressed. Yeah.
Where is the ruchnius?
He's lacking a little.
That's only good.
I'm going to sit down for this one.
Okay, it's a good question. A teenager is depressed. Where's the ruchnis in the depression?
Pardon?
You want to know where's the ruchnis in the depression?
Why a teenager? Old guys not depressed. Older guys not depressed.
Rabbi Litzman calls us all teenagers. You have to understand. No, because he's even younger.
I'm trying to give an example that people experience and can answer. Why does it act?
Yeah.
It doesn't see the eloquence. It's very simple.
Ratios and other planets also important.
Chulin daf kuf tes amad beis. 109b. Huh?
Are the ratios on other planets also important?
Yes, the ratios on other planets are also important.
They should all be
If what? If what?
It's like in the forge.
Because each planet is a manifestation of a different Indian. Each planet is a manifestation of a different Indian in Elikus. Elikus is infinite. Just like on this planet, every creature is a manifestation of a different... every snowflake is a manifestation of something distinct. And that's why every person has their own light to give to the world. That's why you have your light to give to the world that nobody else could give. You understand what I'm saying? Why do you have your light? Because you're not like anybody else, and nobody's like you. The Mishnah says, "Ein deyaseh in Shabbos." No two minds are alike. No two faces are alike. It's not a mistake. So if you say it's all random mutations, then there's no mashal, there's no nimshal. It's just one big mistake. But the yesod of Yiddishkeit is that there's meaning in existence. Part of that meaning is not just that we were created. It's that our structure itself is divine. One of the biggest yesodis of Torah Baal Shem Tov. Not just we were created, but we remain creations. But our chemistry is divine. So there's an intimacy between the creator and the creation. There's a relationship. The creation is also a reflection of the creator, to a certain degree, obviously. Tafasta? Okay. He madrege hel yoina sheba b'koyach ein serv bakshama. The hest. Sei mas b'de mechitten. He madrege hel yoina sheba b'koyach ein serv bakshama. Every grape that Herzog wine squeezes is koyach ein serv sheba bakshama. Chwesh is the wine, chwesh is the grapes. The wine.
That's why it's called divine.
That you should have said. Chasugas gvul. Apparently, v'lo nachem alakim. Nicht als. Yeah, by nachem was taken alakim. It's als avaya. Can sagen the tate my name. That's why you didn't have to sign the settle in the house.
It's interesting. Sadiq Gaon said, person is not interested in science and understanding everything. He's not interested in divine. He's not interested in God.
Yep.
This class is brought to you by theyeshiva.net. Please help us continue the classes. Make even a small contribution at www.theyeshiva.net/donate.